Do you and your students feel like you are part of a supportive and encouraging community each time that you and they walk into your classroom? How do you even create this type of learning environment? Today, Elodie Channa, who is a French teacher in British Columbia, Canada, joins me to bring us into her classroom community. We discuss how she uses CI, Comprehensible Input, techniques and methodology to support the classroom community and ensure that her students feel valued, seen, and understood. So let's jump in. Are you a language teacher looking for some reassurance that what you're doing in the classroom is on the right track? Or maybe you're looking for some ways to teach even more effectively. If you're one or the other or somewhere in between, you've landed in the right place. This is the World Language Classroom Podcast with your host, me, Joshua Cabral. You're about to get tips, tools, and resources so that your students continue to rise in proficiency and communicate with confidence. Let's jump in. Vamos, allons-y. Hello, my friends. Bonjour, mes amis. Hola, mis amigos. Welcome to the World Language Classroom Podcast. I am Joshua Cabral, and thank you, as always, for listening and being introspective about your teaching and just being interested in what teachers are doing and saying and how you can use that in your own classroom to be thinking about improving or just reminding yourself or getting reassurance that you're on the right track. All of those things are great reasons to be listening. So on today's episode, we are going to be talking about building community in our language classrooms, but specifically from the lens of CI, and CI is comprehensible input. So it's not an either or in our classroom, that you're either building community and you're getting to know your students, and that's one side of it. And then you're doing CI and making language comprehensible for your students, but it's not an either or, it's more of a both and. So how can you actually use CI in building that classroom community? And so to help us have this conversation today, I am joined by Elodie Channa, and she is a French teacher in Canada. She was originally teaching in Ontario, and she is now in British Columbia. So she's moved to the other side of the country, and she has been teaching for about 14 years. And if you are on Instagram, you have likely seen Comprehensible Input Ontario, which is where she and her teaching partner, Terry Ann, have lots of reels about language teaching where you can watch them on there. I always love to sit down, have a great cup of coffee, and just go through their reels once in a while to figure out, oh, that's great. That's a new idea on that. So you likely have seen them there, but also Elodie has presented at OMLTA, which is her provincial organization for language teaching. I often talk about the state organizations in the US, but in Canada, they're provincial. So that is the Ontario Modern Language Teacher Association. And she's also presented at a couple of virtual conferences like Comprehended and Practical and Comprehensible. So out there sharing with teachers, and I'm so happy and delighted to have you sharing with us today. Elodie, welcome to the World Language Classroom Podcast.
Merci, Joshua. Thank you so much for this invitation. I'm very excited to have this conversation with you.
So let's dive right in. And I think CI and comprehensible input is generally a well understood concept and term right now. But just to make sure we're on the same page, can you start by telling us what your personal understanding of what CI is and why it is so pivotal and important in our language learning?
Absolutely. So CI stands for Comprehensible Input, and the term was coined by the research of American linguist Stephen Krashen, and his research focuses on language acquisition. So CI is not a method, but it's how we acquire language. And I explain it to my students like this. Comprehensible, meaning that you are understanding messages that are happening in the class. And then languages can be listening, writing, reading, and speaking. And two of those are inputs, two of those are outputs. So, from your perspective as a student, you're going to listen to a lot of messages you understand, and you're going to read a lot of messages that you understand. So, really, it's focusing on meaning over form in the classroom.
And in Canada specifically, we talk a lot about ACTFL, which is our mothership organization in the States. And we talk a lot about communication modes and the proficiency levels. And within the language teaching community in Canada, is that terminology that is used, or just talk to us a little bit about how that works in Canadian teaching?
In Canada, each province has their own curriculum standards. So we usually refer to the curriculum documents of the province. So the Ontario province has the Ontario document, BC has its BC documents. And instead of having the modes like in the US, we are divided into reading, listening, speaking, and writing. So that's usually how teachers in Ontario would frame that. And then instead of having the framework in the US that goes from like novice, low, mid, high,
Mhm.
we usually follow the Common European Framework, which is the A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, C2 framework for language proficiency.
Students that do a full sequence of language through the high school level, and you're a high school French teacher, if a student does the full sequence of available courses at a high school level in say Ontario, what level of the European framework would they generally attain?
If a student who started French in Ontario in grade 4 continued all the way to grade 12, they would typically end up at a B1 level. However, in Ontario, French is only required till grade 9, and typically you're there at an A2 level
Mhm.
of French.
If we continue on this journey with CI, now let's start to bridge making language comprehensible in the classroom and building community. So, can you start to build that bridge for us and what that looks like for you?
Humans, we're hardwired for connections. And so using CI, we can tap into that. And it means using the language we have, even with our novice beginner students, to get to know each other and build connections. It gives language a purpose, a task, an authentic task, if you will, for us to do something with the language. I can compare it to before I was on the sort of the CI track. We would have one day, let's practice saying where we live. And so I would throw a ball and students would say, j'habite à blah blah, j'habite à blah blah. And 20 some students would go and we would remember none of it. Whereas now, when I focus on comprehensible input as the pillar of my classroom, we're going to listen to each other's answers and actually get to know each other that way. And that's really made a big difference in my entire program. My teaching has definitely come in phases. My first year, I was teaching straight out of a textbook. And back then, our Ontario curriculum expectations were heavily grammar linked. But then we had a curriculum revision where we focused more on meaning over form. And then I came across CI in around 2017 or so and have been sort of transitioning my teaching since then.
Prior to having CI as your focus in your classroom and the comprehensible input, were you already doing activities and topics that were building community prior to doing that?
I think I've always tried to bridge community and bring fun and joy into the classroom. And some things worked. I wouldn't have been able to tell you why they worked.
Hmm.
And I think that the more I learned about the research behind comprehensible input, I was able to be like, that's why that's working. And that's why I should do more of that and less of this.
Okay, let's unpack that why a little bit. So, when you say, oh, that's why it was working, what's the answer to that? Why was it working? Or why is it working now for you?
Because when students are beginners or novices or at that A1 level, right? You need to be very intentional about the high frequency of the words that you use so that the net of vocabulary that you use isn't too wide, but that it's more narrow. If you pick the right words, they're able to communicate all sorts of messages. And before being very intentional about that, I would often step out of bounds, and then all of a sudden everything would kind of fall flat in the class. And
Mhm.
so by making sure that I stay in bounds to those high frequency words, I find that we're able to do a lot more things more in depth in the language rather rather than stay very surface level by having too wide of a net of vocabulary.
Mhm. As you were talking a little bit ago about building the community in your classroom, I was hearing a lot about personalizing the language to students and that being one of the pillars of building community. So, can you tell us a little bit about how you keep the language relevant and personal to students in your classroom?
I was taught this in my early days of CI to start a class with this activity, and I've fallen in love with it, and I think I will do it forever, which is an activity called Card Talk. And Card Talk is one of those CI strategies where you ask students, typically on a piece of paper. I use index cards, and during the COVID years, they had a Google slide where they insert an image on a slide, but you give them those cards and then they draw something based on a prompt. And the prompt I like to go with for grade 9 is an activity that they like. And so they'll draw out that activity, I'll collect them, and then I'll ask for a volunteer. And one volunteer will always raise their hand. And I will start asking simple questions about the activity that they like. And if the class is very novice, very beginners, again, the levels vary and fluctuate section by section. Like, oh, you like this activity? And they'll tell me yes or no. And I'm not there to embarrass them. I'm there to support them in the language. If they don't know the French, I'll write it on the board. And I'll ask questions about, where do you do this activity? Do you do this activity just for fun, or do you play in a team? Do you want to do this professionally, et cetera, et cetera? And again, sort of seeing where that limit is, pausing, asking comprehension questions, and making links with the students. And I will interview every single student in those first few weeks of the class. And so everybody will get that spotlight and that light shown on them and showing that everybody matters. We're going to see everyone. And it's also been really cool to see, after I interview a basketball kid at the end of class, a couple of the kids will huddle up and be like, hey, you want to meet here at lunch and let's play basketball. And that's
Hmm.
awesome. Or the artists will find each other and be like, want to see my sketchbook? And
Hmm.
watch those friendships blossom. And particularly in grade 9, in my teaching context, everybody's new to the building. And so if I can also help facilitate those friendships, love it.
So it sounds like by making the language relevant and interesting to students, where they're able to personalize it, you're almost creating that community organically because you were just saying those connections like, oh, let's go do that after because I heard that you like this. And so, in thinking about community, it's not always this idea of this is how we're going to build community. These are the steps we're going to follow to build community, but it's actually giving students an opportunity to express themselves and to personalize. As their classmates are hearing that, then they start to build community with that.
Yeah, for sure. I'm not looking to just build a community within the walls of my classroom. I want that to spill out into their day to day life. That's how we make language be a living, breathing thing and not a practice of
Mhm.
a couple of words.
And in terms of getting students to engage with the language, and I'm going to use the term the affective filter, which is another Stephen Krashen term,
Mhm.
and that lowering the affective filter so that students are less risk averse, they're willing to engage. So, what are some things that you do in your classroom to build a community of engagement where students are willing to take risks and aren't fearing the language?
I will speak on some general tips, and some students will need more, and some students will need less, and that's completely fine. But I tell students from the get go when they step into my class that I'm getting to know them, I'm getting to know their language level, and whatever they walked into my room with is the perfect level for this class. You are not behind, you are not dumb, you're not good at languages, you are perfect just as you are. I will make sure that the first time that kids will snicker at each other about a language mistake, I like hard paused the class and I was like, nope. Did you see me laugh at anybody? I didn't laugh at any of you, and I'm more proficient at the language than you. We're not going to do that here. So, trying to catch those things is the first thing. The second thing I learned from Scott Benedict, and it works really great, and I'm speaking specifically at that grade 9 level, which is the earliest level that I teach, is that in the first week, I almost always sort of subtitle myself on the board by writing both the French and English as I talk, or pointing to high frequency word posters that I have. And it makes it so that students who don't need that extra support, they can kind of just ignore it, and they do. But those students that will need that word can just point, and I'm not embarrassing them. I'm not trying to say kind of gotcha and so forth. So, for example, for those card talks, the word équipe goes there really quickly, and I'll point at it every time. It says équipe equals team. And within a couple of classes, students will feel much more comfortable. And since they saw that I'm not embarrassing the students for the card talks, that'll make them be like, okay, Madame's not going to embarrass us. And I find that for the rest of the semester, anytime I'm like, all right, we're going to do a new activity, I need 2 volunteers, I will always get at least 2 volunteers to do anything in the class.
Let's talk about some specific activities that you're doing in the classroom. I know when teachers are listening to the podcast, they a lot of times will listen on their way to school in the morning or on the way home, and they're thinking, oh, I can maybe try that out tomorrow. So what are some of your go-to effective or maybe even most enjoyable activities that you do with students that are CI based but are also community building?
So I'm going to give 2 things that you can do. One that's bigger, like a routine you can incorporate, and one that sort of can fit in anywhere. So the first one is special student interview. I find is a great activity to build community in the class, and it's something that I try to do once a week. And basically what that activity is that you will ask for one student volunteer, and I tend to always have at least one volunteer to go up. And then you'll ask them a couple of questions. And if you're looking for banks of questions, you can go to Bryce Hedstrom's website or Cécile Lenné's website, or Martina Beck's has some slide decks. And you will ask questions, and you're not asking questions for them to just answer and that's it. Like, where do you live? I live here. Okay, move on. You live here. Great. Have you lived there all your life? Were you born in this place? Like, you ask natural follow-up questions, going slow, giving lots of support, asking the class if they understand, but also linking it to the class. So if they say, I was born here. Oh, and class, is anybody else was born here? And sort of making those links and those connections. So that's a really great routine that I try to do once a week. Another thing I try to do kind of all the time is what's known in the CI world as PQA, or personal question and answer. And that's when you take any subject, anything you're talking about, and you try to relate it to the students and their lives. So, for example, in my grade 9 class, we read a novel, Xenix, by Teresa Marama. And at some point in the novel, it talks about how the protagonist, Xenix, doesn't like to go shopping in general, except if it's art supplies. And so I'll pause the reading right there and I'll ask, hey, do you like shopping? We'll take a little class survey. We will then ask like, oh, what kind of things do you like shopping for? Or you like shopping for shoes? Anybody else like to shop for shoes? If I wanted to go shopping for shoes, where will you tell me to go shop for shoes? Or somebody will talk about, like they like to go for grocery shopping, and ask, okay, what's the best grocery store to shop at? And sometimes a PQA is just one question and it's 2 minutes. But sometimes, like talking about shopping, that can take 45 minutes of the class, just because we're really engaged in it and students are sharing different things and what's their favorite that and so forth. And it can lead to really great discussion while getting to know each other.
You're going to have students progressing in their proficiency. So, how do you plan for and then execute those activities so that they're helping students to grow in proficiency?
I got this really amazing framework. The idea of making sure that your program kind of spirals out, So in that grade 9 class, they're pretty novice, so we're trying to focus on a more limited amount of vocabulary. And as they progress through the program, that vocabulary net gets further and further. And when you look at something like the Common European Framework for Learning Languages, but you'll notice that when students are at those beginning levels, the A1, A2, a lot of the topics refer to the self. And the more you get proficient, the more you can spiral out so that they can get to grade 12 and debate current events and so forth. It makes it that for my CI sort of pillar activities for students, we're also going to level up that kind of topic of we know each other more so we can get to know each other more on a deeper level. So, for example, in a grade 10 class, a special student interview is not going to be sort of those basic personal questions, but if we're focusing on talking about their childhoods in the past, their special student interview questions are going to be things like, did you have a favorite toy or a favorite TV show when you were younger? And did you have a special like blankie or stuffed animals? And so they'll be more thematic. If we're talking about technology, we'll have special student interview questions on technology use and how often do you use your phone? And can you share like your top apps? And are you comfortable sharing this or that about your technology use? I also learned a great framework from Benjamin Tinsley, which is whatever topic that you're talking about in class, you can always start from home. Try to figure out what it looks like with your students in your community before you go out and make those connections with the greater Francophone world. So last year in my grade 12 class, I was piloting one of his units on wedding traditions in the Francophone world. And we started out by talking about wedding traditions in our own community. And so I started by bringing out photos from my own wedding. And so we kind of picture talked them. And then I asked students who had experiences going to a wedding if they wanted to share their experience or if they wanted to share the experience of a parent or a loved one's weddings. And so then we ended up spending a couple of classes because students just brought all these pictures of outfits that they wore, pictures of their parents getting married, and we just ask questions based on the picture. So again, it's focusing on that comprehensible input of making sure there's messages we can understand, but we're still getting to know each other on a deeper level because sharing how, the Nigerian wedding traditions of their parents didn't come up in grade 9, 10, or 11. So we can definitely adapt that to every single level.
There's a unique thing that happens in our language classes. It's how personal learning becomes. And it's a way that I guess happens maybe in some other classes, in their English classes or their history classes when they're giving opinions. But we so often are talking from the first person perspective and giving our own personal opinions. So these are the expectations we have of our students, that they're talking about their favorite things or things they like or things that they don't like or weddings that they've been to. And we are so often asking them to be so personal. This idea of building community is going to do more to lower that affective filter. I'm just constantly amazed at how introspective we ask our students to be in our language classrooms. And I don't think we realize how much we do it, but that you like, you don't like. Oh my gosh, I never really thought about if I like dogs, do I prefer dogs or cats? I mean, even at a lower proficiency level, we're having students do that. Before we finish out this conversation about community and CI, do you have any suggestions or your tips from experience for teachers that are trying CI out for the first time or building community with their students? Do you have any tips you would share with teachers?
A tip that I often give, and I think, Joshua, you give a very similar kind of line of thinking, is that if CI is new or newish to you, it can very quickly feel like you're trying to drink from a fire hose and get really, really overwhelming. So I always tell teachers, you pick one thing, no matter how small, and you try that. So, for example, based on the conversation we're having, can you find one personal question and ask that to your students based on the topic that you're doing and really listen to the answer of your students rather than focus on the form of how they answer that question?
That's a little bit of the challenge of doing this podcast is it's constantly bringing ideas to teachers, but then having to remember, don't do the fire hose. And I think that's how we feel inspired. So it's that good recommendation that even though you're incredibly inspired, to still do it in manageable ways.
Got to keep things sustainable for sure. We don't want teachers to burn out. So you got to do what you can with what you have. So one thing at a time for sure.
And it's good enough.
Yes.
It's good enough. Yes. So any recommendations that you could offer to our listeners right now about this topic or other people, conferences, books, things that you might be engaging with yourself right now?
I have a terrible time at recommending one thing because there's so many amazing things. So I'm going to recommend three
Hmm.
things, and then sort of pick and choose what sounds best for your context. The first is a Facebook group that was very, very dear to me when still today, as I was learning CI, was the CI for French teacher group. There's a lot of amazing people and generous people that just share so much there. And so if you teach French CI, I would recommend to go to the CI for French teachers. The second I will recommend is a blog, and that is Cécile Linné's blogs towards proficiency. She's a wonderfully wise educator. She's brilliant at what she does. And last year on her blog, she taught me a new extension for Card Talk, which is that, say, if a student the day before talked about swimming and they like swimming, the next day she'll start class by reading a little biography of a famous French swimmer. And like that, you'll have some vocabulary repetition, and then you'll be able to sort of compare and contrast the two together. And it was a great way to link culture from those first sort of days. And I thought it was brilliant. And last but not least, I will always plug Benjamin Tinsley at Afro Franco when I get a chance to, because building community is so important so that you can mirror those same skills at building community and connections with communities around the world. Ben is brilliant at centering Black and Brown Francophone voices while seeing the whole students in front of him in his classroom. And to me, that's a constant source of inspiration.
Oh, yes. He's always a constant source of inspiration for all of us. Big fan of him myself. I'm sure teachers are feeling very inspired right now. And so, how can we be connecting with you to go deeper on these concepts and ideas?
I love to connect with teachers. The best way to contact me or to find me is over on Instagram or Facebook at Comprehensible Input Ontario. But Ontario is just the letters ON, it's the abbreviation of it. You'll find myself and Terry Ann there. Terry Ann specializes in elementary, and I specialize at the secondary high school level.
And you have awesome reels. You have really great
Thank
reels.
you.
So I totally recommend teachers go out and just jump on. Just know that you're going to go down a rabbit hole. So give yourself some time.
Drinking from the fire hose. Start one thing at a time.
Yeah. Well, the great thing about reels is they're short, they're concrete. I will say, after the practical and comprehensible workshops this summer that happened, I saw that you put a reel on where you got an idea about doing calendar talk and putting in cultural elements. And so you went on and you showed some examples of how you were taking the idea you had learned from John Seifert, who had done the workshop.
That's right.
And you immediately started thinking, okay, I want to try using this. So you did a couple of examples. And then I loved how introspective you were. You put it out to the community of teachers and you said, before I go all in on this, give me your thoughts. Is this something, am I on the right track here? And you wanted to use it. And so that was brilliant that you were using the community to do that, but also so much respect for you as a teacher to try something new immediately and then to seek that feedback. So I just wanted to let you know that that was very much appreciated. I saw that, I think, last week.
Oh, thank you, Joshua. Yeah, I try to act on when I have those big bursts of inspiration, trying to see how I can apply it right now. And I'm very much against the whole teachers are an island thing. And in at least where I'm from, a lot of teachers, they're the only French teacher in the building. And so if we can make our jobs easier by connecting with each other, that the hours I'm going to put into this resource is going to be useful for somebody else, then that's worth it to me.
I actually had John Seifert on the podcast. I interviewed him about the calendar talk, which was his topic at Practical and Comprehensible. And I told him about your reels. Oh, just so you know, Elodie up in Canada, she took it right to heart. And he was like, oh, really? And he grabbed his phone and he wanted to go and find the reel. So just so you know, you're doing good stuff. So to finish up our conversation, I always like to leave our listeners with a hearty piece of advice. So what advice can you leave with our listeners?
Find the joy in the classroom where you can. and make things sustainable for you. It's very easy when you listen to podcasts or Instagram or conferences to get very overwhelmed that you're not good enough. There's always room for improvement for everyone, but you are good enough right now. So find the joy, find the sustainable rhythms. You're doing a good job.
Thank you very much for that. I love championing teachers and recognizing all the great stuff that they're doing. And you, my friend Elodie, are one of those incredible educators. Clearly, you love what you're doing. And thank you very much for your willingness to share it with us here on the podcast, but regularly in Instagram on your reels. You and Terry Ann together just bringing us constant tidbits and insights. It's so very much appreciated. And these are not things that don't take time. So I know that you're taking the time and you're dedicated to really serving and reaching out and building community, which is our whole topic today. And you do such a great job of building our language teacher community. So again, thank you for all of it.
Thank you so much, Joshua. I don't want teachers to feel like they're islands. You are not an island. There's people out there that want to connect with you.
What are your takeaways from that conversation with Elodie Channa? Are you seeing how building community and engaging in CI are not mutually exclusive, but rather can be used together to achieve your teaching and learning objectives? Be sure to check out the show notes to connect with Elodie Channa. You'll also see the link to sign up for Talking Points, my weekly email newsletter with tips and resources for language teaching. There are also links to get in touch with me if you'd like to work together, and we can do that either in person in your school or remotely. I will talk to you soon. Bye for now. Thank you for listening to the World Language Classroom podcast. Be sure to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so that you never miss an episode. Let's keep the conversation going on social media. Connect with me on X, aka Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at WL Classroom. And for even more valuable resources, visit my website, WLClassroom.com, where you'll find over 300 blog posts about language teaching. So stay inspired, keep growing, and continue making a difference in your language classroom.